Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. And to all of those who are on the call, I'm Rafe Sonenshein, Executive Director of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State LA. And on behalf of PBI and Cal State LA President William Covino, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer Jose Gomez, and Chief Mission Officer Belen Vargas, we welcome you to this really extraordinary event. We're so happy to have you with us. We can't see you, but you can see us. But we know that you're there and that you're attentively involved. In 1987, former Governor Pat Brown brought PBI to Cal State LA, which is now the #1 university in the nation for the upward mobility of its students. We're dedicated at PBI to unleashing the power of participation as we inform, engage, and inspire. To learn more about our programs such as Civic U, the Southeast LA Initiative, political debates, census outreach, racial and ethnic surveys, the PBI Manat Quiz, visit our website at patbrowninstitute.org. Each year, we honor very special leaders in our communities at our annual dinner. As I'm sure you can imagine, we had to cancel this year's dinner, as many organizations did, but we have no intention of canceling our recognition of this year's honorees, who are Antonia Hernández and Alex Padilla. We want every PBI event, whether it's a dinner or a gathering of some kind or another program, to bring you substance. This morning, we honor our first honoree, Antonia Hernández, in the PBI way, through what is sure to be an informative, engaging, and inspiring conversation among three great leaders in philanthropy who have long worked closely together. Later this summer, we will likewise recognize our second honoree, Secretary of State Alex Padilla. This hour-long program is being recorded, and we'll share the link with you in the coming days. So if you miss a couple of things, don't worry, you can always catch up. And if there's a story that you wanted to check out, we'll have it available to you. The audience will be muted. Our time is extremely short. We're going to go only for an hour. And I want to maximize your chance to listen in on the conversation among these outstanding leaders. So we won't break for a formal Q&A, but feel free to use the chat function to share your thoughts as the event proceeds. My picture of this event is we're all of us sitting in a coffee shop, if we're ever allowed to sit in a coffee shop again. And three people walk in who seem to know each other very well and sit down at a table nearby. And as they start talking, I lean over because what they're talking about sounds awfully interesting. I hear them, I say, wait, could that be Bob Ross and Antonia Hernández and Fred Olli? But they really are having an interesting conversation. I want us to listen in on this conversation today. I'll be the moderator. I don't think it'll be too difficult to get these folks to talk with each other, but we're really looking forward to being in the coffee shop listening to a great conversation. Let's get right, though, to our first business at hand, which is to confer a very special award on Antonia Hernández, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the California Community Foundation. At the age of 26, as a newly minted graduate of UCLA Law School, who had grown up on LA's East Side and graduated from Garfield High School, Antonia Hernández joined others at the LA Center for Law and Justice in filing a landmark class action lawsuit against the forced sterilization of Latinas at the LA County USC Hospital. In 1981, she joined the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, which has been at the center of historic civil rights actions that have protected and expanded the rights of Latinos, not just here, but throughout the whole nation. She rose to become president and general counsel of MALDEF and helped lead the successful legal fight to invalidate Proposition 187. I want you to glance at that picture and look at Antonia's face as she is in the room with Governor Pete Wilson. It was a very intense time, and that picture says 1,000 words. In 2004, Antonia was named president and CEO of the California Community Foundation. The foundation has served Angelenos for over a century. In her years at CCF, the foundation has granted nearly $2 billion with a focus on health, housing, education, and immigration. Under Antonia's creative and committed leadership, CCF has become a deeply impactful change maker in our region, expanding beyond grant making to civic engagement and public policy. PBI has had the wonderful experience to work directly with CCF on census outreach and with other funders on the Southeast Los Angeles Initiative. In 2013, citing Antonia's leadership, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy awarded their NCRP Impact Award for grant-making public charity to the CCF. In our present moment of crisis, Antonia can be found leading and collaborating at the multiple tables where the crises of equity, justice, and policy are being addressed. I have been very fortunate to sit at some of these tables representing PBI and to watch Antonia call people together from all walks of life and to get them to take action. We're kind of inclined to do what Antonia would like us to do because she's got a really great direction for us. In 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom, feeling the same way, appointed Antonia to his task force on business and jobs recovery. In recognition of her lifetime of service and dedication in the struggles to create a more just and equitable region of state, the Pat Brown Institute is honored to grant the 2020 PBI Philanthropic Leadership Award to Antonia Hernández. Now, if we were in person, I would hand this award to Antonia. This award, which is a picture of Pat Brown, is done by hand by an artist who has been doing this for more than 20 years, Alex Shagan for the Pat Brown Institute. He's largely retired, but continues to do this for us every year. Antonia, I'll make sure to get this to you in person at some point, but probably not right away. So I'd like to congratulate you, Antonia, and ask you to say a few words to us today.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story. Grew up in East LA in the projects, and being the oldest girl in the family, my father always wanted me to go to college, but of course to follow the Mexican traditional of staying at home. So first the dream was to go to ELAC. I walked from my home in the projects to ELAC, and the next one was to go to the University on the Hill. And the University on the Hill was Cal State LA. Somehow I got diverted and ended up at UCLA, but I'm proud to say that 3 of my siblings have received degrees from Cal State LA. And to my papa, may he rest in peace, the ultimate was the University on the Hill. Thank you for the recognition.
Wonderful. Thank you, Antonia. That's great to hear. And I know our university will be very proud to hear that. Well, now we're going to bring in 2 more people who, oddly enough, all 3 of these philanthropic leaders within about a 5-year period joined in leadership roles in their foundations at around the same time and have been very strong collaborators with each other. I'm going to introduce them both first. Bob Ross, Dr. Robert Ross, one of the nation's leaders in health philanthropy, both as a medical doctor and executive. He's been called upon not only as a teacher and medical doctor, but as a member of several presidential commissions and task forces. He received his BA, MA, and MD from the University of Pennsylvania. He has received awards too numerous to list, but trust me, they're all great. He was named by Capital Weekly as one of California's most influential civic leaders in health policy, and the Nonprofit Times designated him as one of the 50 most influential nonprofit leaders in America. At the endowment, Dr. Ross has made the foundation a major force for addressing the health needs of underserved Californians, helping lead the historic reopening of the Martin Luther King Medical Center and upgrading of the Charles Drew University. The endowment is now nearing the end of a 10-year statewide commitment of $1 billion to build partnerships for healthy communities. PBI, we had the opportunity to work for several years with the endowment's Building Healthy Communities Committee in Boyle Heights on a community-based research project that we are very proud to be part of. So we feel like we've been part of the endowment family as well. Today, Bob is bringing the attention of philanthropy to the health and well-being of young men of color here and across the nation, and he continues to be a national authority on health inequity and public policy. Bob Ross, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Fred Olli. Fred began his career in 1972 as a volunteer teacher and counselor in a small western Alaska village. Over the next 19 years, he held a number of key positions in Alaska, including president of Kuskokwim Community College and vice chancellor of the University of Alaska Anchorage. In 1991, he came to Los Angeles and became executive director of Covenant House. He received his undergraduate degree from Santa Clara University, his graduate degree in education from the University of Michigan. Fred was elected president of Weingart Foundation in June 1999 and named CEO in 2006. He serves on the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations and the Mayor's Fund of Los Angeles. Previously served as board chair of Southern California Grantmakers. Under his leadership, the Weingart Foundation has invested in the long-term sustainability of nonprofit organizations and has embarked on a dramatic program to enhance equity, especially in the areas of race and ethnicity. We have had the opportunity at PBI to work closely with the Weingart Foundation through the Sulla Collaborative on their very powerful and helpful work in the Southeast Los Angeles community. Fred, welcome and good to have you with us.
Thanks, Rick. Good to be here.
So we know we have these very important people, but I have a couple of questions, and the first one is a personal one for each of you. You're all warriors for social justice in different ways and in overlapping ways. What first ignited your passion for social justice in your life that brings you to where you are today? What do you recognize at that point from a moment that brought you to where you are? Bob, Ross, can we start with you on that?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Right?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So thank you, Rafe, so much. Kind introduction. I prefer your opening metaphor that the three of us would walk into a bar rather than,
we can adapt.
okay, so I'll tone down some of my comments. And congratulations to my great friend, our great friend, Antonia. I love the photographs. Beautiful, beautiful selection and choice of our friend and warrior for social justice, Antonia. Yeah, I think, you know, for me, Rafe, and again, thanks to PBI and its leadership. For me, it's a combination of a couple of moments. I mean, one was just growing up in the South Bronx. Our family grew up in the South Bronx in the in the 60s, which was not a let's put it this way: the South Bronx was not Bel Air at that period of time, and saw a lot of both community violence and drug violence in the neighborhood growing up. And then went on to become a pediatrician. And the real sort of epiphany moment for me in the career, which was pivotal, the arrival of the crack cocaine epidemic while I was in pediatric practice on the East Coast, both in North Philadelphia and in Camden, New Jersey. And I just saw the devastation that the crack cocaine epidemic brought to the community, particularly the Black and brown community that I was serving as a pediatrician. And it really was an object lesson in the social determinants of health. You know, you get that toxic brew of poverty and hopelessness and drugs and health. And I just saw up front and close what it could do. And even then, I knew that there was something structural going on about this epidemic, the crack epidemic. And then I saw the nation's response to it, which was to criminalize hopelessness and to criminalize Black and brown folks by over-incarceration and hyper-incarceration, a problem that we're still trying to unravel 30 years later. So that was really the eye-opening moment for me about the structural inequality, racial inequality of our systems, and led me to the path of public health and later on to philanthropy.
Thanks, Bob. Antonia, what about you? What was the thing that first put you on this path?
Well, for me, it started really early. And it was 1956. And we were crossing the border in El Paso, Texas. I was a child. I didn't know better. But my father took us to a restaurant that said no dogs and no Mexicans. And those were very evident in 1956. As a child, you know, my father's response, and we didn't understand, any of it, but my father said, "You're Mexican, you're no better, you're no worse. You make your own destiny." We didn't know what the heck he was talking about. But then we drove through Arizona and we stopped at a gas station and the gas station owner wouldn't give my father water. As you know, in those days, you carried a bag outside the carburetor of the car in case it heated up. And so we had to stop at the canals by the freeway, and my father had to crawl to the canal to get water. I knew that this was not right. I knew that this was not fair. And so for me, getting respect has always been very important. And my father, his family was deported from Texas into Mexico during the 1930s. So he was born here. He, is a citizen. He always, watched and followed politics very closely. In my family, voting is almost like sacred. And even though he didn't speak English, because he didn't go to school, he taught himself how to read and write. Politics was always at the center of our table at dinner time. So I grew up in a family that valued voting, participating. My father would drive me to the picket line, to demonstrate against Safeway. He would drive me, to demonstrate with Cesar Chavez. So I've always grown up in a very politically attuned, active family. And so my path, career path was basically that I was going to go to college and be a do-gooder. And then here I am.
Wonderful. Thank you. What about you, Fred?
Thanks, Rafe. And by the way, congratulations, Antonia. This is a wonderful honor for you. I'm a little confused though, Bob. I thought we were all being honored today. But this is like par for the course. If we had gone to that bar, I prefer that. I prefer that imagery as well. But if Bob and I would have been in the bar with Antonia, it was because she had called us there, and we had gone reluctantly because she was asking us for money, right, Bob? That's the way the three of us roll. So, but anyway,
philanthropist by day, shakedown artist by night.
Exactly. My board doesn't want me to ever answer her phone calls because it always costs us money. She's very good at what she does. But anyway, so I guess I grew up similar to Antonia. I grew up in a family that actually valued social activism. Grew up in the Chicago area. Even at a young age, the disparities were all around me. I could see that. And, but my real activism, I guess, started in high school, actually. I was a youth organizer in the old Gene McCarthy campaign. For those of us who are old enough to remember that, it was really fueled by, opposition to the Vietnam War. And that activism continued all through college. It went from anti-war stuff to civil rights stuff. And I think the thing that maybe had the most profound impact on me, in answer to your question though, Rafe, was the early days that I spent in Western Alaska in the villages, where I got to see very up close in a personal sort of way what, quite frankly, government-sponsored racism can do to a group of people. In this case, the Yupik and the Athabascan Indians of Western Alaska. It had a tremendous impact on me, and has, from that moment on, sort of fueled the desire to be involved in social justice work and work involving racial equality. So.
Well, thank you all three for such profound answers, personal answers to that question. And I think young people today will resonate because they're now wondering if their experiences in our crises today will lead them perhaps to where you are. Let me ask you something about where you are. We are all desperately concerned about inequity, not just the crises themselves, but the inequities of the crisis. And all three of you have been leaders in this. And my question is, I read in the Times today, it said that government and business and individuals all have a role to play, but philanthropy is playing a very important role. What's your sense of what philanthropy brings to the table in fighting these desperately damaging inequities that we're now displayed for the whole world to see as we face these crises? So any of the three of you to start that conversation. It's a critical conversation, I think.
You know, I guess I'll go ahead and start. So I think, you know, first of all, Rafe, I think that we're actually fortunate in Southern California and in California in general to, in this moment, to have a number of philanthropic institutions that, while they may not use the equity word, are committed to advancing social, economic, and racial equity. And so we're very fortunate. It's not like that across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other thing that is worth pointing out is that, you know, a colleague of ours, Antonia and Bob will know who I'm talking about, in response to the question we often get about where is philanthropy's accountability? You're really not terribly accountable organizations. The response was, well, yeah, you know what, that may be true, but we better do something as a result of that. We have an ability to act that we're not as constrained in our actions as other civic leaders might be. And so it gives us an opportunity to lead in areas where there might be reluctance on the part of others. And but I think in this moment, those of us who have the ability to use our voice and to use our resources to speak out against injustice, to advance social, economic, racial equity, I think that's our obligation and we need to take advantage of it. And we're seeing evidence that that is in fact occurring in Southern California in particular, with philanthropic institutions and across the state.
And I would add that something that's, I think, quite unique is the trust and the relationship that we have among our collective. You know, Fred, Bob, and I have this trust with one another, this comfort level, but it extends to other folks. But, you know, one of the things is, Bob is, a statewide funder, Fred is a regional funder, and I'm a community foundation. And from my lens, what I find really interesting, in philanthropy is that we are a product of the place that we function in. And in LA County in Southern California, we have a very weak business leadership infrastructure. Most of the corporate sectors have left. LA County, Southern California is the 8th, 9th economy of the world, but it's made up of small businesses. So what has happened is it has allowed philanthropy collectively to play that civic leadership role. And because many of us have the same values, our ability to work together and to leverage. And the interesting thing is that philanthropy is venture capital. Most of the money that comes to help people in need comes from the public sector. And our willingness to partner with the public sector, to understand the role that the public sector plays, is critical in trying to address issues, whether it's food insecurity, support of community clinics, our immigrant community. And it's that collaborative approach that we have, that comfort level of calling on one another. And yes, I pick the pockets of anyone who comes close to me, because for me, it's for the community, for the LA community, for the betterment of the community. And I think the three of us or the others understanding our respective roles and how we can leverage one another is really critical. But I cannot overstate that it's based on relationships, it's based on trust, it's based on alignment, that we see the world with a similar lens, and that we know we can make a difference.
Bob, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, so, we're at this really interesting moment, historical moment for the nation on the matter of transformation, right? And so, for me personally, and I'm probably, I've evolved as a foundation president, and I've evolved sort of in partnership, with my colleagues. I mean, I think Antonia was at this place probably before Fred, just given her background. and her track record of leadership at Maldev. But when I entered philanthropy, like many others in our field, I kind of worshiped at the altar of innovation.
Mhm.
You know, that innovation was really the mother's milk of transformational change. And I've been transformed in the work, in watching the work. It's really not innovation. I think innovation is necessary, but it's overhyped. The real mother's milk of change is power. It's voice. It's activism. And we have seen, through our investments in organizations who do power building for a living, who engage in advocacy, who engage in activism, who push county and city and state and federal governments for positive change. That's a pretty substantial return on the philanthropic dollar in terms of investment. And we've seen it with the Dreamers. We've seen it with DACA. We've seen it with since Prop 187. Every time there's a dark, vulnerable moment for our communities, it gets transformed into real powerful change. So I think the last thing I'll just say is, and I think the three of us agree with this, the three of us are we're closer to the dusk of our careers than the, that's safe to say.
Mm-hmm.
We're at this moment, Fred, Antonia, where just gliding off into the sunset on the back of our awards and resumes is not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to challenge one another to step up our game in this very transformative and powerful moment. And at least at our foundation, the more we invest in advocacy, activism, voice, and power building, particularly from the closest to the grassroots level, the better the results get and the stronger the transformation is. And I think we've been locked arm in arm, the three of us, in gathering those lessons, and we've seen it work. It works. LA is now the crucible. I would argue LA is the crucible of effective community impact, social impact activism and advocacy. We got a lot of really sophisticated grantee partners that we all support, and we're proud to support them, and we just need to stay locked arm in arm with those that are on the front lines in the fight.
Bob and Antonia, if I can, Rafe, if you don't mind me adding something here.
Please do.
I think, Bob, Antonia, I think the other thing that has been helpful is that all three of us have spent time inside government. And when I came into philanthropy, I'm sure you'll say the same thing was true with you. There was this real resistance for philanthropy to be involved with government, to do anything with government. And the three of us, I think, did come in with a different mindset because of our experience inside government, and recognizing that there's resources there. You can achieve leverage if you in working with government, and we've all done that. We've all done that in different ways. And the other thing, Rafe, I would say is that I think the three of us have really have been humble enough, if I can say this, to learn from one another. I mean, I've watched Bob over a number of years now in his funding of advocacy and organizing groups. And, more recently we talk about funding power building. And the Weingart Foundation has learned from that experience. And Bob, I think it's probably true that you've taken a page from our book in terms of the importance of supporting nonprofit capacity building and resiliency. And Antonia has certainly taught us the value of, working with pooled funds and collaborative approaches, from the justice fund to criminal justice, a variety of different things. But as Antonia says, it's all based on this trust and relationship that we've developed with each other and also with our other colleagues in philanthropy.
And let me add this, that the most important, when being at Maldev, I knew my world. I understood systemic change and going at the heart of the institutions that were causing the harm. And when I came to CCF, people would ask me, how did you go from being a troublemaking lawyer to the head of philanthropy? And I would say, to me, sort of Maldev was a means, and the strategy was litigation, public policy advocacy. To me, CCF and philanthropy is just another vehicle with different tools. Money, bringing people together, collaborating. But at the heart of it is going at systems change. And today, give you a perfect example. Yes, we are having a food insecurity. People are hungry. So we must give to the food bank. But then we must ask the question, why are they hungry? What's the source of the hunger? What can you do at the source to change it? Get people signed up for CalFresh, change the rules and the regulations, work with the county and the state to alleviate the bureaucracy. You always have to look at the root causes. And to me, that's the most important thing. And like Bob said, having been a troublemaker, I definitely understand the value of community organizing, of power building, because the change is going to come from the bottom up. And all we as philanthropy are enablers, giving the resources to the people in community who know what they need to do to change. So to me, what's happening today is like the virus and the killings have exposed for everyone to see. You need to be blind not to see the inequities. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to change it? How are we going to reimagining a more equal society? And then the work begins, and it's hard work. It's incremental work, and we got to stick with it.
Bob, how do you get at power to make the systemic change that I think Antonia has clearly indicated here? You do have to be blind not to see it. And maybe the first time I can ever remember that it's been out there so clearly for all to see. How does that power work? How does philanthropy move government, which has a different calendar? The next election is often the calendar. So it's hard to have a long-term perspective. When you're dealing with government and power, how do you flex that, what you three have, to make it move in that direction to get at root causes?
Yeah, I mean, it's power building it's a muscle, right? I mean, what we've learned as a health foundation. Remember, we're a health foundation, so we came at this recognition through a health lens. But what we've learned over the years is the best thing we can do for the health of our state, and I would argue, of course, the health of our nation, to advance wellness and health, is a vibrant, engaged, robust democracy. Mm-hmm. And that's not where I was when I came to the foundation. I was very much sort of a health policy, health coverage kind of guy, and we've all seen it. Fred and Antonia, we've seen it. When we started building healthy communities, it was 10 years ago. The smartest thing we did, Rafe, was we made a lot of mistakes, but the smartest thing we did was to give this initiative 10 years. That was the smartest move we made, was to give it 10 years, because you need to see that kind of time. And I remember a grantee organization we support. In fact, we've all supported them, the Youth Justice Coalition in South Central Los Angeles. And I remember visiting them in a site visit, 10 or 11 years ago. And this was talk about grassroots. This was continues to be a very grassroots organization led by young people who had been impacted by the system. They had been serving in juvenile hall themselves and had come out of the system, and they were arguing, they articulated a vision for change. This was 10 years ago now. That said, yeah, well, eventually we want to see all youth prisons and youth detention facilities closed. And we want to divert those criminalization and punishment dollars into youth development dollars. And so that sounded like a pretty bold, some might say not very pragmatic vision at that time. And 10 years later, they're achieving it. We're seeing youth detention facilities in Los Angeles close down. We're seeing decarceration. We're seeing movement where the County Board of Supervisors is now trying to move dollars out of criminalization and punishment and into prevention and community supports. And so it doesn't happen overnight, but it's happening. And so in any case where you just see that kind of transformative change, if you try and get the dollars to energetic, passionate people who have been most impacted by the inequities and inequality that Antonia talked about, that's a better investment. I hate to say this way, but just to make the point, that's a better analysis investment than Rand or Harvard or Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Investing in a 19-year-old who's been in the system, who's been traumatized by the system, and has ideas for how to reimagine it. That's the smartest investment we possibly could make. So it's just trusting those folks at the front lines who've been severely impacted, and trusting them as the experts. And they won't disappoint you. They just won't disappoint you. It may take longer, but they will make good things happen. We just need to trust their instincts.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think about something, Bob, is that I've noticed in the last few weeks that folks like the Youth Justice Coalition and others who have been fighting a little bit out of the mainstream for ideas have suddenly emerged in the mainstream. And that's a challenging moment to be in if you've been fighting with a lot of integrity from outside the mainstream system, and suddenly everyone's calling you and saying, what should we do? What should we negotiate? How can philanthropy help that work? Because that's a hard, isn't that a hard transition to suddenly be in the power world in a more direct way than had been before?
Not really.
I would say the best possible problem to have, right?
Yeah.
It's a better problem to have. I agree. It's a great problem to have.
And actually, the thing is that we've been funding those groups for a long, long time. And so, I mean, sort of going back to what Bob said earlier, we need to make room for them to assume leadership roles, to partner with, the folks who have been, to move them even further in their leadership development. And we might not like what they say and how they say it, but the fact of the matter is that they've been on the ground, pushing the envelope, doing this stuff. So the best thing we can do, whether it's communities and schools that's coming up in the November ballot, empower these organizations to mobilize, to organize the community, because that's where we're going to see the leverage of our dollars, is in the investment on these folks.
Yeah, Rafe, I think what you're seeing now is the result, to add to what Antonia said, I think what you're now seeing as the result is funders having invested in these groups over now a fairly long and consistent period of time. They have matured as organizations, and it's great to sit back and see them sort of assume their role as they should be playing. I mean, this has happened in the area of immigrant rights. It's happening with the census work. It's now going into redistricting work. So it's great to see, and I think that will just continue. But that's the power of philanthropy and being able to do that, and then unleash the power of communities.
Well, it did make me think about something you said at the beginning of our conversation, Fred, is that philanthropy is not government.
Yeah.
Government has to sort of drive down the middle, and that often drives out groups that have something to say. But philanthropy has been able to help create this moment.
Yeah.
And it's very exciting to see it continue. Antonia talked about the private sector not being as strong in the LA as it is in other parts of the country, and the philanthropy stepping in. Given that, we've talked about government and power. What is the relationship of philanthropy to the private sector in LA? Is it more at the smaller company level, the big companies, or how does that work? It's challenging. It's challenging for that relationship to work, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is challenging for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's harder to sort of find those partners. We have the LA Chamber of Commerce, we have some others. And it does hurt the community in general, because I think we would be all the more effective if we had a more robust, engaged civic leadership in the business community. But I would say that, like, for instance, sometimes the issues that we're funding of community empowerment and community power building go contra to some of the interest of the business community. And I'm speaking, of, communities and schools. The bond measure E for LAUSD that was opposed by the chamber. So I think, that we in philanthropy, and I can speak personally for myself, I need to work harder in finding those connections in the business community, because I think we need the three sectors. We need the public sector, the private sector, and philanthropy. The other thing about philanthropy, and that's what's so interesting and invigorating here in Southern California and in California, the leadership of philanthropy in California is very diverse. If you take the leadership of philanthropy from California out of the picture, it's a very lily white world. Secondly, philanthropy tends to be risk adverse. And we're not risk adverse. And that's what makes it a very effective, it elevates our impact, is because we're not risk adverse. And all of us, the three of us, however we got to where we are today, we understand that power building is the only thing that's going to change and make it better for those that are vulnerable and are poor and have been marginalized. Mm-hmm. And nobody gives power away. And understanding that you have to nudge, you have to take, sometimes you have to grab, but you need to do this in a win-win situation. And I think that LA is an exploratory laboratory for us to reimagine a different, more equal society.
Bob, the private sector and healthcare policy and government, that's kind of a triad there. How do you see that playing out, the relationship of, it's a semi-privatized, semi-public healthcare system that we're trying to fix somehow, right?
Yeah, we remain in this ongoing sort of existential race about the relationship between our health system and who it's supposed to serve. I think, we all have an equity and racial justice lens, and so it's harder to swallow and accept that, in particular, for-profit healthcare is the way that, if I can make a distinction between at least for-profit healthcare and healthcare, it's with all of the lobbying musculature of big pharma and the drug industry and of the for-profit health industry, it's hard to make the case that the system we have works for everybody. It just doesn't. I would go upstream a little bit with your questioning, right? But it's going to land very much in a PBI kind of place. What's at stake right now with the moment that Antonia and Fred have spoken to, the combination of COVID-19 and the Floyd George killing and unmasking all the structural and racial inequalities, where it's interesting whether we're going to end up at a moment where the social contract of our civic society is redefined. And we haven't had a conversation about social contract in this country since the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. It's been a while, right? And that thing was written, by white men for white men, when Black people were considered to be 3/5 of a human being. So, what you're raising in terms of the role of the private sector, the role of corporate, the role of government, those are social contract kinds of questions. What is the relationship between the governed and the government? And what's the role of the business sector in all this? And I think the moment we're in is raising those questions, but now we've got to take advantage of it. And can we come away with, let's see, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, 2026?
2026.
Maybe that's the time that we do this again, dealing with issues of racial inequality. But I think the questions are really fundamental. They go beyond whether we should just build on Obamacare. These are some really fundamental questions about health for all, economic inclusion, housing inclusion. And I hope we have the courage, I'm speaking to my colleagues now, Antonia and Fred, I hope we have the courage to really lean into this moment with fighters and warriors on the front lines who can give us the kind of transformative change that a new social contract is going to require.
You know, Rafe, I wanted to add to Bob's comment that I think the three of us and our colleagues understand that, you know, this business of philanthropy goes beyond just making grants. I mean, it's using voice and influence. And you've got to be willing to, of course, do that. I wanted to mention there's a fairly remarkable thing going on right now that all three of us have had involvement in initiating, and it's called the Committee for Greater Los Angeles. This is a group of, I hate to say it, involves a couple other fine universities in town. It involves the University of Southern California and UCLA. But we brought together a group of some of the activist organizations we were talking about earlier that we've been funding around the table with representatives from the mayor's office, from the county, with private business, with labor, to look at the recovery from COVID-19. And increasingly, that look has become focused on how we address the issues of structural and systemic racism that have been so highlighted as a result of the pandemic. So this is a group of people that is meeting regularly. There is going to be a report that is produced in August that is really going to hopefully provide a roadmap to not only philanthropy, but to government, to business, to labor, on how we come out of this crisis, not going to where we were before, because where we were before was not such a great place, but how we envision things in a way that really get at some of the systemic and structural issues, especially around systemic and structural racism that have held this country back and this region back for some time. Now that's an example of what philanthropy can do by using its voice and influence to convene people, bring people together to create this kind of action. So we'll see what comes out of that. But it goes to your question about where's the business sector. I've talked to people in the business sector and I've said, if you resonate with some of the recommendations coming out of this report, you can't sit on the sidelines, you got to get involved.
This was a question I was going to ask you three as we get close to the end of our conversation. I don't want to return to normal. And I don't think you do either. And I think most of us don't. But we may have an unprecedented opportunity to make a new normal, which is vastly different. And I think for our audience, none of us want you three to, what did Bob say, go off into the dust at this point. We need you right now. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit from a call to action standpoint. What do we need to do, philanthropy and us, all the people on this call and all the people we know, to make sure that when attention flags in government and in other places, as it inevitably does, that we're really working to bring new ideas into the mainstream that have been on the outside, that are now considered well worth discussing? And how can we move forward to a newer and better normal? What should we be doing? What do you want to do? How do you want to, what's your piece of this that Bob said at the start, he's not satisfied. He's not satisfied even what philanthropy is doing. What do you want to do going forward? And what should we be doing to be part of it?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the original sin that this country was founded on racism, because we have to face that and understand that we have to change the infrastructure, the structures that solidified privilege and that solidified who gets in and who's not, who is valued and who is not. And those are really difficult decisions that we might have. And I must say, racism is the original sin that has impacted and affected all of us. Okay, and within our communities, we have to have those difficult conversations. And we have to really understand how hard this is going to be. You know, when you talk about housing, it's structural racism that it has us where we are. When you talk about the business community, our democracy was not formed to support and undergird the business community. It was for the people and by the people. Somebody take over because I got a phone call.
Life in 2020. Bob, you want to pick up the thread? Where do we go from
Yeah,
here?
so yeah, and I think you're asking the right question, right? Because each one of us has to take stock, not just institutionally, but individually, right? On a piece of this. And the thing is, it's bigger than any one of us, but the problem is not bigger than all of us, right? So I would just invite each of us to think about our own institutions. And so putting, you know, if I were sitting in academia right now, if you completely reimagined and reinvented curriculum and decisions like, I don't know, research grants and how tenure is decided.
Mm-hmm.
If you made transformative change, and structural racism sort of the it of the, you know, what would, you know, how would tenure change?
Mm-hmm.
How would the curriculum, how would the course requirements change, right? And so for philanthropy, we need to do that audit of ourselves is in order to take advantage, I mean, to your question, to take advantage of this moment in its optimal way, what do we have to do? And I think for us and Fred and Antonia and I know we've worked together too long for us not to know this about one another. We got to be careful not to try and get out there and pretend that we can lead this.
Yeah.
You know, our job is to get resources in the hands of people who are closest to the fight and trust them in supporting their fight. So I'll give you one concrete example that's live right now. County Board of Supervisors is going to look at their budget. I think they're having budget hearings this week and next week. The budget and the county budget, and of course, all the county budgets are going to be strained right now because of COVID and its economic impacts. But right now, the county is looking at, you know, what's the proportionate share of funding that goes to criminalization and jails and the sheriff's department versus care and services and community supports. And so the advocates, many of them that all of us fund and support, Weingart Foundation, California Community Foundation, a group of advocates came together and they have an alternative budget. They put together a care first budget, not a criminalization budget, not a punishment first budget, but a care first budget. And it's pretty sophisticated. I mean, this was not done on a back of an envelope. It's, you know, it's researched, it's referenced, it's got data, it's got charts, it's got tables. And these are by advocacy organizations who, you know, are close to the fight. Many of them have people in their organizations who've been impacted and have been formerly incarcerated themselves. And so they're putting forward a proposal right now that's live to the County Board of Supervisors that says, we have a transformative way forward. And so, you know, what we might do, I might do an op-ed in support of that, or we might issue a joint press release or a statement that in support of that alternative budget. But the thing we need to do best is to get resources in the hands of those who know how to fight this fight. And be patient and be supportive and trust them, and they will not disappoint. They may not get everything they want in that alternative budget to the county, but they're going to make some noise, and they're going to get some attention paid to it, and they're going to show a different way forward.
What about you, Fred? What's your take on this as we wrap up, as we come close to the end here?
Yeah, I would really agree with Bob. You know, as Manuel Pastor pointed out in State of Resistance, his book about California, many of the social justice wins that we've seen over the last number of years came as a result of a group of very savvy organizers, advocacy groups, that really led those fights. As Bob said, putting resources in the hands of those individuals is really important, especially now. So, I mean, I think that's a continuing role for philanthropy, and these groups need long-term, steady, unrestricted support in order for them to continue to grow and to develop. You know, the other thing I would just say is this, is that, you know, we all know that, you know, the tragedy of George Floyd was not some isolated sort of racial incident in America. It was part of a system of structural and systemic racism, as Antonia said, that has been the original sin of this country for so long and has held so much of us back. So I think it's also incumbent upon all of us to also look inside our own organizations, look first at ourselves and then inside our organizations, and look at our policies and look at our practices. Look at who we hire, look at who we use to invest our money, and just ask the question, are these policies, are these practices, are they racist or are they anti-racist, to take a page out of Ibram Kendi's book? And where we see there's problems, where we see racism manifest, we need to disrupt it. And we can do it, as Bob said, by putting resources at the hands of community groups, and at times demonstrating, using our voice and our leadership positions to demand change.
I have a few thoughts to share with you as we close up, but also to let you know, and then I would like Antonia to have the last word as our official honoree, although really Bob's right. I mean, we're really honored, all three of you, but I'm left with this feeling that's very good for me in a tough time, that you three are in the game for keeps for a long time to come, and that the lights may go on and off, but we can count on philanthropy in LA to stick to these basic issues, whether they're popular or not, because this is what philanthropy can do. And I don't know about everybody online, but we're getting tons of comments on the chat line congratulating all three of you for everything you're doing. And I think you should be very, very proud of that. Antonia, how about a last word for all of us from you?
You know, change is within our power, but we have to do the hard work. It's not easy, it's hard. You have to engage, you have to vote, you have to be civically minded, you have to participate in the census. You know, change is what we do every day, and it's cumulative. And change is not voguish. One step forward, two steps back, but always moving in the right direction. So I would say to all folks, please do the hard work. It's not somebody else's issue. It's not somebody else's problem. We are the solution. And if we're not the solution, we're the problem.
Well, I think that's an imposing thought for all of us to take back to all of our organizations. While we're all still on screen, I want to thank our audience, our wonderful audience, thank our three honorees today. We'll share that honor.
Yes.
But Antonia, Bob, and Fred shared a lot with us today. I think we all learned a tremendous amount. I want to thank our staff. I also want to thank our program supporters for 2020, Southern California Edison, California Community Foundation, Coca-Cola, California Latino Legislative Caucus Foundation, SCIU Local 721, Supervisor Hilda Solis, Wells Fargo Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, the Weingart Foundation, Southern California Gas Company, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, State Farm, IBEW number 47, and the LA Department of Water and Power. But I don't know, I'm just filled with a lot of gratitude that I got to sit in this coffee shop / bar. And I can tell you with these three people, whatever it was, whether we're drinking coffee or beer or just sitting and thinking, to have the chance to spend all this time with the three of you has really been a treat for all of us. And thank you so much for being with us. And with that, we will say goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Be safe
Thanks,
and well,
Rafe.
everybody.
Bye-bye.